The letter hit the floor of the saloon before Sarah Thatcher could catch it, and every man in the room turned to look at her the way men always did, like she was a problem somebody else had already failed to solve. "Read it out loud, sweetheart," called Beau Harlan from the bar, his voice slick as boot grease, his smile the kind that never once reached his eyes. "We all want to know what brought a woman like you all the way out to Caldwell." Sarah's fingers found the envelope on the dusty floorboards. She straightened up slowly, deliberately, the way her mother had taught her to stand when the world tried to press you down into something smaller than you were. 26 years old, arrived on the afternoon stage from Wichita, with one carpet bag, $32 hidden inside her corset, and a forged letter of introduction from a boarding house that no longer existed, and already she could feel it happening. That particular shrinking. That familiar collapse of self that started somewhere behind the sternum and worked its way outward until a woman disappeared in plain sight. "That letter," said another man, thick-necked and wearing a deputy's star that had clearly been self-appointed, "looks like it might belong to somebody important, somebody who maybe ought to explain herself." The room laughed. The laughter was its own kind of trap. And then the door opened, not dramatically, not with the slam of boots or the theatrical jingle of spurs. It opened the way a man opens a door when he has nothing to prove, quietly, completely, and with the careful attention of someone who understands that the world requires a gentle hand far more often than a hard one. Emmett Covington stepped inside. He was not the tallest man in the room, nor the broadest. He wore no deputy's star, no flashy gun rig, no hat with a theatrical brim. He was perhaps 30 years old, lean in the way of men who worked honestly and ate simply, with dark hair grown just slightly past what was fashionable, and eyes the color of creek water in October, gray-green, still and unfathomably deep. He took one look at Sarah Thatcher standing alone in the middle of that laughing room, the crumpled letter in her hand, and something shifted in his expression that she could not immediately name. It was not pity. She had seen enough pity to recognize its condescending architecture. It was something else entirely. It was recognition. He crossed the room without hurrying, stood beside her rather than in front of her, and said, to no one in particular but to everyone at once, "Evening." Then he picked up the fallen bag strap she had not even noticed slip from her shoulder, held it out to her, and said quietly, just for her, "There's decent boarding at the Whitfield house on 2nd Street. Clara Whitfield doesn't allow harassment on her property, which puts her in a rare category in this town." Sarah stared at him. He did not stare back. He was already looking at the room again, and there was something in the stillness of him that made Beau Harlan put his drink down and find a different direction to look. "Thank you," Sarah said. He nodded once, turned toward the bar, and ordered coffee. It would be 3 weeks before she understood that Emmett Covington had just saved her life, not from the dramatic, gunshot variety of danger that dime novels celebrated, but from the slower, quieter, more devastating kind. The kind that came from being made to feel, day after day, like you were worth considerably less than the dust on a man's boot heel. But to understand why that moment mattered so absolutely, you needed to know where Sarah Thatcher had come from, and what had been done to her before she ever stepped off that stage into the choking summer heat of Caldwell, Kansas, in the August of 1883. Sarah had been born in Abilene, the second daughter of a cattle broker who prided himself on getting good value for everything he acquired, including his daughters. Her father, Robert Thatcher, was not a cruel man in the way that required raised voices or raised hands. He was cruel in the administrative sense, a man who calculated worth in ledger columns and found women perpetually undervalued as assets. He had married Sarah's mother, Ellen, for her family's connection to a livestock supply company in St. Louis, and when that company dissolved in 1871, he'd spent the next decade making sure Ellen understood, through 1,000 small and bloodless interactions, that she had failed to deliver adequate return on his investment. Sarah had watched this. She had watched it with the wide, cataloging eyes of a girl who understood something was deeply wrong but lacked the vocabulary for the injustice of it. She had watched her mother fold herself smaller and smaller until, by the time Sarah was 15, Ellen Thatcher moved through the house like a shadow trying not to disturb the wall. "A woman," her father told her, the day she turned 18, "is worth exactly what a man is willing to pay for her." He had meant it as practical wisdom. Sarah had filed it under evidence for the prosecution. The man her father had eventually selected for her, one Thomas Greer, a rancher from outside Dodge City with an impressive spread, a moderate drinking problem, and a spectacular opinion of himself, had reinforced every lesson Caldwell's saloon was now trying to teach her. Thomas Greer had proposed in a way that felt more like a land annexation than a declaration of feeling, and Sarah had accepted because, at 23, she had believed her options were narrowing in the specific way that women were told their options narrowed when they refused to behave like practical creatures. The engagement had lasted 8 months. During those 8 months, Thomas Greer had called her opinionated, difficult, a woman with too many thoughts for her own good, and memorably, at a dinner party in front of 6 other couples, the kind of woman who makes a man tired just by existing in the same room. The room had laughed. Sarah had sat very still and smiled, and felt herself becoming smaller by the inch, the way she always did, the way every man in her life had perfected the technique of making her become. She had broken the engagement on a Tuesday morning in March of 1883. She had returned the ring, gathered $300 she had saved from household accounts over the course of 8 careful months, written her mother a letter she hoped carried enough warmth to survive the cold of the house it was delivered to, and stepped onto a stagecoach headed east to Wichita. In Wichita, the $300 became $212 after a rooming house that charged more than advertised, and a confidence man who sold her a letter of introduction to a boarding house in Caldwell that did not exist. Which was why she arrived in Caldwell with $32 and a forged letter, and a room at a saloon she had not intended to enter, and why the first thing Caldwell's men had tried to do was confirm everything every other man had already told her about the space she was permitted to occupy in the world. And then Emmett Covington had opened a door quietly and held out a bag strap and pointed her toward Clara Whitfield's boarding house on 2nd Street. Clara Whitfield was 62 years old, built like a woman who had survived every single thing the frontier had thrown at her and found all of it insufficiently impressive. She had wide gray braids and a handshake like a closing deal, and she charged $6 a month for a room that included meals, which was more than fair, and she looked at Sarah's $32 and said, "I'll take 10 now, and you can work off the rest helping in the kitchen until you find employment. I don't run a charity, but I do run a fair establishment which some people around here find indistinguishable." Sarah said, "I'm good with accounts. I managed household books for nearly a year." Clara said, "Denton's Dry Goods has been looking for someone to manage their ledgers since March. Tell Amos Denton I sent you, and that I'll break his front window if he haggles you below fair wages." She got the job. Caldwell in 1883 was a cattle town at the height of its raucous, complicated energy, the southern terminus of the Kisham Trail, where Texas longhorns arrived by the hundreds of thousands, and the money that followed them attracted every variety of human being the frontier produced. There were honest working people, and there were people who found honesty inconvenient. There were cowboys who had ridden 3 months through impossible country and arrived wanting drink and noise and companionship, and there were people who provided all three at varying prices. There was also a small, stubborn community of men and women who had come to build something lasting out of the noise: farmers, merchants, schoolteachers, and one very quiet man named Emmett Covington, who had come to Caldwell from somewhere he rarely discussed, to do work he performed with a thoroughness and care that set him apart from nearly everyone around him. Emmett worked for a horse trader named Garfield Moss, which meant he broke and trained horses, a job that suited him with an almost perfect precision, because it required exactly the qualities he possessed in abundance: patience, silence, careful observation, and the ability to communicate trust to a creature who had every historical reason to distrust. Sarah learned this about him incrementally, in the way you learn things about quiet people, not through their own announcement of themselves, but through the observations of people around them who had been paying attention. Clara told her, while they needed bread one morning 3 days after Sarah's arrival, that Emmett Covington had been in Caldwell for 2 years and had never once been in a fight, which in Caldwell was either a sign of extraordinary character or extraordinary cowardice, and in Emmett's case, Clara was prepared to argue passionately for the former. "He broke a horse last spring that 3 other men had given up on," Clara said. "Spent 11 days on it, patient as stone. That horse is now the gentlest animal in this county. He seems," Sarah said carefully, "kind. He seems quiet," Clara said, "which most people mistake for weakness. It isn't." She punched the bread dough with decisive authority. "Weakness is loud, always been my observation. Loud about what it needs, loud about what it's owed. Strength is the quiet kind, takes its time." Sarah thought about that. She thought about it particularly the first time she encountered Emmett again after the saloon. It was at Denton's Dry Goods, 4 days into her new employment, when she was cross-referencing a supplier invoice against delivered stock and discovering a discrepancy of $17 that told a pointed story about someone's arithmetic, deliberate or otherwise. Emmett came in for rope, canvas, and a tin of linseed oil. He placed his items on the counter, counted exact change from a worn leather pouch, and was nearly to the door when he paused and looked at her. "Did you find the boarding house all right?" he asked. "I did," she said. "Thank you again." He nodded. He had a particular way of nodding, not the dismissive bob of a man who wanted conversation to end, but a full and considered acknowledgement, as though what you had said deserved to be properly received before the moment moved on. "Clara's a good woman," he said. "Caldwell's better for having her in it." "It seems like it could use a few more people in that category," Sarah said, and was surprised to hear the edge in her own voice, the honest edge, the one she'd spent 3 years sanding down to nothing under Thomas Greer's relentless commentary on the unattractive quality of women with sharp opinions. Emmett looked at her with those October Creek eyes and said, "It could. You seem like you might qualify." Then he went out the door. Sarah stood holding a supplier invoice with a $17 discrepancy and felt something she did not immediately recognize, because it had been so long since she'd felt it. It was the sensation of having been seen accurately, without reduction, without the particular squinting appraisal that men usually applied to women before deciding what category of object they represented. He had looked at her and said something true about her, and he had said it the way you state a fact, without ornamentation, without agenda, without the implication that it was a gift she ought to feel grateful for. It was the first time in longer than she could precisely calculate that a man had made her feel worth considerable notice. She filed the $17 discrepancy report with Amos Denton and said nothing about why she kept making arithmetic errors for the rest of the afternoon. September came, and the cattle drives thinned as the season turned, and Caldwell's population shifted, some cowboys moving on, others settling into a winter that would bring its own complications. Sarah settled into her routine with the focused energy of a woman who understood that self-sufficiency was not merely practical, but was also the most honest form of dignity available to her. She was good at the accounts. She was methodical and precise, and she had a memory for numbers that Amos Denton called uncanny, in a tone that suggested he was not entirely sure whether to be impressed or unsettled. She chose to interpret it as impressed. She began to learn Caldwell's social geography with the careful attention of a newcomer who understood that every frontier town had its hidden structures, its secret alliances, its dark past buried just below the surface of ordinary commerce. Clara Whitfield knew everything, as landladies of her type always did, and she dispensed information in measured quantities over meals, as though she had curated a curriculum. There was the marshal, a man named Holt, who was effective enough at his job when he wasn't performing it for an audience. There was the town council, 3 men who owned between them the majority of Caldwell's commercial property, and whose decisions about the town's development were not entirely separable from decisions about their own financial interests. There was Beau Harlan, who turned out to be not merely an unpleasant saloon regular, but the son of the largest cattle operation that ran through Caldwell, a young man of 28 who had grown up being told by everyone around him that his wants were the world's obligations, and who carried this belief with the casual confidence of someone who has never been meaningfully contradicted. And there was Emmett Covington, who existed slightly outside all of these structures in a way that was not antisocial, but was genuinely independent, a man who kept his own counsel, did his work with rare excellence, and seemed to have decided that most of what passed for social performance in Caldwell was not worth his participation. Sarah found herself noticing him the way you notice something that requires patience to understand, not with the sharp, immediate focus of attraction, though she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that was also present, but with the quieter attention of someone who recognizes something worth studying. She noticed, for instance, that when Emmett spoke, people listened, not because he demanded it, because he had cultivated the discipline of not speaking until he had something worth saying, which meant that when he did, the words carried a weight that louder men never achieved. She noticed that he was thoughtful with animals and careful with children, and treated Clara Whitfield with the specific, deliberate respect of a man who had decided that competence and dignity deserved acknowledgement regardless of social convention. She noticed that he read actual books, not just newspapers, which in Caldwell in 1883 was not as common as one might hope. She noticed that he never once looked at her the way other men looked at her. He never assessed her with that particular inventory glance, the one that started at the face, moved efficiently downward, and returned with a verdict about her suitability for various purposes. When Emmett looked at her, he looked at her face. He looked at her eyes. He looked with the specific attention of someone who was interested in what she was actually thinking. It was, she found, almost unbearably affecting. The first real conversation happened in the middle of October, on a Saturday afternoon when the dry goods store was quiet, and Sarah had finished the week's accounts, and was reading a 3-month-old copy of Harper's Weekly behind the counter when Emmett came in, not for supplies, but apparently for something less definable. He stood at the counter and looked at the magazine and said, "Any of that worth reading? There's a piece on railroad expansion in the territories that's either very informative or very alarming, depending on your position on the matter," she said. "And a short story about a woman who solves a murder in a country house in England, which I found considerably more satisfying." Something in his expression shifted, not a smile exactly, but a movement toward one. "Which murder was it?" "The husband," she said. "Obviously." He laughed. It was a quiet laugh, low and genuine, nothing performed about it, and it transformed his face in a way that made Sarah's ribs feel briefly insufficient for their structural purpose. "I'm sorry," he said, "I don't think I properly introduced myself the other night. Emmett Covington, Sarah Thatcher. You're managing Denton's accounts." "I am." "Good," he said simply, and she got the impression that he had already formed a view on this and found it correctly arranged, and that his approval was not condescension but genuine satisfaction on behalf of a proper outcome. "You train horses," she said. "I do. Clara says you spent 11 days on one that no one else could manage." 12, he said. Clara's generously rounding down. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "It wasn't about the horse being difficult. The horse had been handled badly and had perfectly good reasons to be frightened. It wasn't a problem of the horse. It was a problem of what had been done to the horse." Sarah held very still. Most things that appear difficult, Emmett continued, as though he were thinking aloud rather than making a speech, are just things that have been mishandled and need time and patience to remember that they can be trusted. He was talking about the horse. He was also, Sarah understood with a certainty that arrived like a warm shock to the center of her chest, not only talking about the horse. She said that's either a very compassionate approach to animal training or a very perceptive observation about people in general. I've found it works for both, he said. He bought a book of matches and a new penknife and left, and Sarah sat very still for a long moment afterward, holding Harper's Weekly without reading it, before she made herself pick up the week's completed ledger and put it in the drawer where it belonged. Beau Harlan began to become a problem in November. He had noticed Sarah in that proprietary way. He noticed most things he wanted, and Caldwell was a town that had historically found it convenient to accommodate what Beau Harlan wanted, because his father's operation brought money, and the money was real even when the respect it purchased was not. He came into Denton's on a Wednesday morning when Amos was at the bank and Sarah was alone, and he leaned against the counter and said, "I've been thinking about offering you a better position than bookkeeping for Amos Denton." "I'm not looking for a different position," Sarah said without looking up from the ledger. "You haven't heard the offer." "I don't need to." She made a notation in the ledger. The notation was accurate. "I'm content here." "Content," Beau repeated the word as though it were amusing. "A woman like you doesn't come to Caldwell to be content. You came here from somewhere, running from something maybe." "I came here for employment," she said, "which I have. I'll thank you to let me do it." He stayed for another 10 minutes, talking at her in that particular way that men like Beau Harlan talked, not conversationally but occupationally, filling the air with himself, making the simple act of being in a room together into a demonstration of whose room it actually was. When he finally left, Sarah realized her left hand was pressed flat against the ledger page in a way that had left a faint smudge in the margin, and she was furious at herself for the smudge because it meant she had allowed him to affect her. She did not mention this to anyone. But Caldwell was a small town, and Clara Whitfield had her own intelligence network, and 2 days later at supper, Clara said casually, "Beau Harlan's been telling people you've been friendly with him." "I haven't," Sarah said. "I know," Clara said, "which is why I'm telling you." She spooned more stew into Sarah's bowl in a decisive way that communicated both affection and strategic solidarity. Men like Beau turn no into a different kind of yes in their own heads. It's a dark past he's carrying, a lifetime of being told his version of events is the only one that matters. "What should I do?" Sarah asked. Clara considered. "Nothing dramatic. Dramatic plays into his narrative. You be exactly what you are, a woman doing her job with competence and dignity, and you let him run out of material." Sarah did this. It was harder than it sounded. Emmett knew something was wrong before she told him, in that perceptive, unhurried way of his that had begun to feel less uncanny and more like a specific kind of intelligence she had not previously encountered. He came into Denton's the following Saturday. She had begun to observe that his Saturday visits were not entirely driven by supply needs, and he looked at her once and said, "Harlan been giving you trouble," she said. "Nothing I can't manage," he said. "I don't doubt that." He was quiet for a moment. "If it becomes something you'd rather not manage alone, you should know that the offer to help is available." It was so precisely calibrated, the acknowledgement of her capability, the offer of support that did not presume upon her autonomy, the complete absence of any implication that she needed rescuing, that she felt the back of her throat tighten with something that was not quite sadness and not quite relief, but was adjacent to both. "Why?" she asked. It was a direct question, and she asked it directly. He met her eyes and said, "Because you seem worth looking out for, and because Harlan's particular type of behavior tends not to stop on its own." He put his money on the counter for the tobacco he'd selected, "and because I'd offer the same to anyone in the same situation. But I'll be honest with you, Miss Thatcher, I'd be more motivated in this particular case." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and left, and she watched the door for a moment after he'd gone through it, and then she turned back to the ledger and did math until her heartbeat returned to a pace that did not constitute a medical concern. The situation with Beau Harlan escalated in a way that felt inevitable in retrospect. The way most bad things do, when you can look back at them and see the trajectory that was always there, the hidden motive running underneath every apparently casual encounter. He showed up at Clara's boarding house on a Friday evening in late November, and this itself was a transgression, because Clara's boarding house was not a social venue and Beau knew it, and coming there was a specific message about the limits he was prepared to observe. Clara met him at the door. What was said between them on that porch, Sarah never learned in complete detail. What she knew was that Clara's voice was not raised and Beau's eventually was, and that when Clara came inside afterwards, she sat down at the kitchen table, poured herself a small glass of brandy that she kept for genuine occasions, and said, "He claims he has honorable intentions and wants to formally call on you." Sarah said, "No." "I told him the same thing," Clara said, in more comprehensive language. "What does he do next?" Sarah asked, because she had learned enough about men like Beau Harlan to understand that the answer to no was rarely nothing. "I don't know," Clara said, "but I'm going to speak to Emmett Covington tomorrow morning." Sarah opened her mouth. "Not," Clara said firmly, "because you need someone to fight your battles. Because Emmett has a particular calm authority that Beau Harlan cannot easily dismiss or provoke, and in situations where a man like Beau is looking for a fight to prove a point, sometimes the most effective move is putting someone in his path who simply declines to provide the fight." Sarah thought about this. "That sounds like you're describing a human shield," she said. "I'm describing," Clara said, "strategic social geography." Emmett came to the boarding house the following morning, not at Clara's direction, as it turned out, but on his own, which Sarah learned when she heard his knock and came downstairs to find Clara already in conversation with him in the hallway. He looked up when Sarah appeared and he said, "Good morning, Miss Thatcher. I heard Harlan came here last night." "News travels," Sarah said. "In this town, immediately." He held his hat in his hands. He had the habit of removing it when he was indoors, which in Caldwell was not universal, and he said, "I wanted to ask if you were all right, and to tell you that I spoke to Marshal Holt this morning." "About Beau Harlan," Sarah said. "About the general pattern of behavior that's been documented," Emmett said carefully, "of which you're not the first example. Holt has limits. His authority and his willingness to apply it are two different things where the Harlan family is concerned, but I wanted it on record, in case anything else happens." Sarah looked at him. He was not performing this. That was the thing she kept coming back to, the absolute absence of performance in everything he did. He was not acting the role of protector for any audience. He was not positioning himself as her rescuer in order to create an obligation. He was doing exactly what he said he was doing, for exactly the reasons he stated, and the transparency of it was so unusual in her experience that she kept looking for the hidden motive and failing to find one. "You went to the marshal this morning," she said, "before you knew whether I'd want you to." "I went for myself," he said quietly, "because I find what he's doing objectionable, and I wanted to say so to someone with a badge. What you want to do about it is entirely your own business." He paused, "Though I'd be glad to know if there's anything else I can do that would be useful." "Have coffee," Clara said briskly from the kitchen doorway. "Both of you. I've made enough for a small army, and I find emotional conversations easier to navigate with something hot to hold." They sat at Clara's kitchen table and they drank coffee, and this was, Sarah would think later, with the particular clarity that comes from looking back at significant moments, the morning that something shifted between them from the interesting to the essential. They talked about Beau Harlan, and they talked about Caldwell, and they talked about Clara's dry wit on the subject of frontier justice, and somewhere in the middle of it Sarah said something about her father's particular philosophy of female worth, and Emmett listened to it with such complete and undefended attention that she kept talking past the point where she normally stopped talking. Past the self-editing function she'd developed over years of learning that too many opinions from a woman were a social liability, and she said things she hadn't said to anyone since she left Abilene. He listened. He asked questions, precise, thoughtful questions that indicated he'd heard exactly what she said and not a curated version of it. And when she was done, he said, "Your father was wrong, in case you needed to hear that from someone who has no stake in it." "I know he was wrong," she said. "I know you know," he said. "But knowing in your head and believing it all the way through are two different things. Sometimes hearing it said out loud helps close the distance." Clara, who was ostensibly doing something at the kitchen counter, and was in fact listening to every word, made a sound that she subsequently claimed was about the bread. December arrived, and with it cold that settled over the Kansas plain like a judgment, turning the cattle town quiet in a way that August heat never did, a different kind of quiet, the interior kind, the kind that drove some people inward and brought out the best or worst of what was already there. Beau Harlan, as it happened, went temporarily to his family's winter ranch operation, which gave Caldwell a specific relief, and Sarah used the quieter weeks to do two things: deepen her competence at Denton's accounts to the point where Amos became genuinely dependent on her, and mentioned the possibility of a raise, and pay careful, honest attention to what was happening between her and Emmett Covington. She saw him most Saturdays at Denton's, but also increasingly at Clara's kitchen table for the Sunday meals Clara hosted for her boarders and a handful of friends, and occasionally in the simple commerce of a small town, at the post office, on the street, at the church that most of Caldwell attended out of habit if not conviction. Each encounter added something small and true to the accumulation of what she knew about him. She knew he was originally from Missouri, from a small farm east of Kansas City. She knew his parents were dead, his mother when he was 14, his father when he was 22, and that he had a younger sister in St. Louis he wrote letters to, with a regularity that Clara noted approvingly. She knew he had been in Caldwell for 2 years after a period he described only as working my way across the territory, and that he had no immediate plans to leave but no architecture of permanent future attachment, a condition she recognized from the inside. She knew he was 31 years old to her 26. She knew he read Emerson and Marcus Aurelius, and a rotating collection of novels that he borrowed from the small lending library that the Caldwell Women's Improvement Society maintained in the back room of the Methodist Church. She knew he had strong opinions about the treatment of the Kiowa and Comanche peoples who had been pushed off the land that cattle trails now crossed, opinions he expressed quietly but without apology, in a town where such opinions were not uniformly welcome. She knew that when he looked at her, something in her chest that had been braced against impact for a very long time began, cautiously and against her own considered judgment, to soften. She did not know what to do with this, because the last time she had allowed herself to move toward a man, the experience had confirmed every warning her rational mind had filed in the years before it. Thomas Greer had seemed adequate before he was revealed as insufficient. Robert Thatcher's philosophy had gotten there first and done the foundational damage, and every man in between, every cowboy who had talked past her, talked over her, used her as a surface to perform their own confidence against, had added another layer to a very sensible armoring that she had worked hard to construct. The problem was that Emmett Covington seemed to be specifically immune to armor, not because he pushed against it. He never pushed. He simply existed in her vicinity with such genuine, uncomplicated interest in what she actually was, not what she represented, not what she could provide, not what category of woman she occupied, that the armor had nowhere to be defensive against and kept sliding sideways when she wasn't watching it. She told Clara this, one evening in mid-December, sitting by the fire in Clara's parlor while the wind made its commentary against the windows. Clara listened in the way she always did, fully, without hurry, and then she said, "What is it that you're afraid of?" Being wrong, Sarah said immediately. Being wrong again about a man's character and paying the price of it. Is there anything, Clara said carefully, that suggests you're wrong about this particular man's character? Sarah was quiet for a long time. No, she finally said. That's what frightens me. Clara nodded slowly. Sometimes, she said, the absence of the familiar danger is itself frightening because the familiar danger is at least a known quantity. What you're encountering is something you don't have established defenses against, which is not the same thing as danger. Sarah looked at the fire. He makes me feel, she said slowly, working toward the words like something she was building rather than finding. Like I take up exactly the right amount of space. Not too much and not too little. Like whatever I actually am is not a problem to be managed. Clara said, that's not nothing. No, Sarah agreed. It is not nothing. Christmas came to Caldwell with a restraint that suited the town. There were decorations on some of the commerce buildings, and the church held a service that drew most of the permanent population, and Clara made a dinner of such ambitious proportion that 3 of her boarders threatened to never move again. Emmett was there because Clara had invited him, and he had brought a small gift, a book, wrapped in plain paper, which he set on the table beside the door in the general vicinity of the other contributions, and which turned out, when Sarah opened it on Clara's instruction during the after-dinner exchange, to be a copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch. I heard you were working your way through Denton's lending library, he said, and his voice was the careful kind it always was when he was saying something that mattered. She turned the book over in her hands. It was not new. It had been read before carefully, the spine slightly softened, and on the inside front cover, in clear, level handwriting, he had written, "For Miss Thatcher, who takes up exactly the right amount of space." She looked up at him. His expression was open in a way it was not always open, the particular vulnerability of someone who has put a true thing into the world and is waiting to see how it lands. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was steady, and her eyes were bright in a way she could not entirely prevent, and Clara, standing behind Emmett with an expression of absolute neutrality that fooled no one present, picked up an empty plate and took it to the kitchen with great purpose. January brought Beau Harlan back to Caldwell with the new year, and he returned in a worse disposition than he'd left, which turned out to have a specific cause. His father, Marcus Harlan, had decided to negotiate directly with the Caldwell Town Council on some grazing rights dispute rather than through Beau, which Beau had interpreted as a vote of no confidence, and which had produced in him the specific brittleness of a man whose ego had been structurally compromised. This made him more rather than less dangerous, because men like Beau, who felt diminished by the people who were supposed to admire them, often looked for restoration in directions that did not require confronting the actual source of their diminishment. He came back to Denton's on a Tuesday afternoon in the first week of January, and he was not alone. He had 2 of his outfit's riders with him, large men who stood in the specific arrangement of people who expect their physical presence to do communicative work. Sarah was behind the counter, alone again, which she was increasingly coming to understand was not coincidental timing on Beau's part. "Miss Thatcher," he said, and his voice had a different quality than it had before, something tighter, something that had decided on a direction. "I've been patient. You've been unwelcome," she said evenly. "I should tell you that Amos Denton will be back within the hour." "That's plenty of time," he said. "I'm going to make this simple. I'm a man of considerable means, and I've decided that you would benefit from those means, and I'm asking you formally to consider stepping out with me." "I don't want to step out with you," she said. "You don't know me," he said. "I know enough." His jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake. A woman in your position. What position is that?" She said it clearly, deliberately, meeting his eyes without a flinch. "I have employment. I have lodging. I have everything I need. What position are you imagining I'm in that would make your attention an improvement?" The riders shifted. Beau's color had changed. "You need to think carefully about." The door opened. Emmett Covington came in. He assessed the room in one complete moment. Sarah behind the counter, Bo and his two riders arranged in the way they were arranged, the specific quality of tension in the air, and his face did not change. He walked to the counter, placed himself beside Sarah in that way he had, the standing beside rather than the standing in front, and said to Bo Harlan, "Afternoon." "Covington," Bo said. His voice had a new edge in it, something that smelled like the forbidden crossing of a line he'd been considering for weeks. "I was thinking I needed rope," Emmett said to Sarah, with the complete calm of a man who had decided on his own terms for the conversation. "But I actually came to ask if you'd like to take dinner at the hotel this evening. Clara's out with her sister, so the boarding house won't have a meal, and the hotel has a decent kitchen on Tuesdays." It was such a perfectly executed maneuver, not theatrical, not aggressive, not a challenge in any form that could be escalated, that Sarah needed 2 full seconds to appreciate its architecture. He had made it about her, positioned himself entirely in relation to her, and utterly refused to give Bo Harlan the conflict that Bo was clearly there to collect. "I'd like that," Sarah said. Bo looked between them. His two riders looked at each other. "This isn't finished," Bo said. "I expect not," Emmett said pleasantly. "But this particular conversation seems like it is." He looked at Bo with something that was not hostility but was absolutely not deference, a steady, level gaze that acknowledged Bo's existence without granting it any particular significance. "You take care now." Bo left. His riders followed. The door shut behind them with somewhat more force than necessary. Sarah let out a breath that had apparently been waiting for its opportunity. "Thank you," she said. "I wasn't performing," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what made it work." "And the dinner invitation, was that part of the strategy or an actual invitation?" He looked at her steadily. "An actual invitation." "Then yes," she said. "I'll go." The hotel dining room was the best Caldwell could offer, which was not grand by any standard of the larger world but was, on a January Tuesday night, warm and relatively quiet, with good lamplight and a beef roast that justified the hotel's periodic pretension. They sat across from each other at a corner table, and they talked for 3 hours in the way that people talk when they have been cautiously circling something true for long enough that the circling has become its own kind of exhaustion. She told him about Thomas Greer. She told him about her father. She told him about the saloon on her first night in Caldwell, and how it had confirmed everything she'd been trying to unconvince herself of. And then she told him about the moment he'd opened that door, and held out the bag strap, and said what he'd said about Clara's boarding house, and how something in that moment had been the first thing to push back against a direction she'd been moving in for so long she'd stopped questioning whether it was the only direction available. He listened to all of it. "I don't think," he said when she'd finished, "that you need me to tell you that those men were wrong and you were right. You figured that out." "No," she said, "I have." "What I'll say," he continued, "is that it matters to me, what you just told me, not as information about your history but because it tells me what you've been up against and how you've handled it, and what I think about how you've handled it is considerable admiration." She held his gaze. "Tell me about your dark past," she said, because turnabout was fair and because she had been wanting to ask for months. He was quiet for a moment, not the deflecting quiet of someone who intends to evade, but the genuine quiet of someone choosing where to enter a long story. "I was engaged," he said, 4 years ago. A woman named Grace in Missouri. She was remarkable, actually. But she was also in love with a man her family hadn't approved of, and I was the approved man, and she accepted me because acceptance seemed like the practical thing and love seemed like a luxury she wasn't entitled to." "What happened?" "She told me the truth," he said. "About 2 months before the wedding. She told me she didn't love me and she did love him and that she'd been dishonest by staying silent and she was sorry." He paused. "I was devastated in the way that your first really significant loss devastates you. But I was also, underneath the devastation, aware that she had done me an enormous kindness by being honest rather than marrying me anyway." "Did she end up with him?" She did. They have 3 children. She wrote to tell me 2 years after. She wanted me to know she was happy. And are you glad for her? He considered this with his characteristic completeness. Yes, genuinely. It took time to get there, but yes. He looked at Sarah. What I took from it was a very clear understanding of what I actually wanted, which is someone who chooses me because they want to, not because they've calculated that I'm the acceptable option. The lamplight was gold between them, and the January cold pressed against the windows, and Sarah Thatcher looked at Emmett Covington across a hotel table in Caldwell, Kansas, in 1884, and understood with a clarity that arrived without drama and without doubt that she was falling in love with this quiet, careful, genuinely extraordinary man. She said, "I'm not choosing you because you're acceptable." He said, "I know." "I'm telling you," she said, "because you said you valued honesty, and I think you deserve to know where I am." He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, carefully, deliberately, the way he did everything, as though the action had been thought through and deemed worth its meaning. His hand was warm and calloused from honest work, and the touch of it was nothing like the braced-against impact she had expected for so long. "I would like very much," he said, "to court you properly, if that's something you're open to." "I'm open to it," she said. He smiled, a full smile this time, complete and unguarded, and it changed his face into something that made her feel as though she had been given access to a room that very few people had been allowed inside. Beau Harlan's final escalation came in February, which was when he made what Clara called his most spectacular miscalculation. He had been building toward something for weeks, making pointed comments in public about Sarah's background, her broken engagement, her arrival in Caldwell under questionable circumstances. He had acquired, somewhere, a partial account of the forged letter of introduction that had brought Sarah to Caldwell, and he had begun circulating it in the way of men who know that reputation is a structure you can damage from a distance without requiring direct confrontation. Sarah found out from Amos Denton, who was embarrassed about it in the useful way of honest men confronted with dishonesty in their community. He came to her one morning and said there was talk, and he wanted her to know he didn't credit it, and he hoped she wasn't troubled by it. And she said she was troubled by it, but she was not going to let it define the situation, and she thanked him for telling her. She went directly to Marshall Holt. This was her own decision, made without consulting Emmett, and she was clear about that when she described it later. She had filed a formal complaint about Beau Harlan's campaign of what she called deliberate reputational damage, and she had presented the timeline of events from her first week in Caldwell through the incident at Denton's in January, documented in writing because she had kept notes with the accounting precision she applied to everything, and Marshall Holt, confronted with a written record rather than a she said he said, had found himself in the position of having to do something about it. He went to Marcus Harlan. Marcus Harlan was, it turned out, a man who had maintained his significant position in the Caldwell cattle economy partly by understanding when his interests were best served by removing complications rather than protecting them. Beau was called to his father's office, and what was said there was not public, but its effects were. Beau Harlan left Caldwell in the first week of March, bound for the family's southern operation in Texas, and the town received his departure with the specific relief of a headache that has finally resolved. Emmett, when she told him about going to Holt on her own, said simply, "That was exactly right." "I know," she said. "I just wanted you to hear it from me rather than someone else." He looked at her. "What made you decide to do it yourself rather than asking for help?" "Because I needed to know I could," she said. "I've spent a long time having men manage situations I was involved in and finding out afterward what had been decided about my life. I needed to handle this myself." "Good," he said, not condescending, not grudging, not qualified with any implication that he'd have done it better. Simple, whole approval. How did it feel? She thought about it. "Like something that has been closed is open," she said. "Like a window." He nodded, that full consideration nod. "You should know," he said. That is entirely consistent with everything I've observed about you since August. Spring came to Caldwell with the particular exuberance of a Kansas spring, sudden and extravagant after the winter's long gray, everything greening at once, the air carrying the smell of new grass and river water, and the distant reminder that the cattle trail would open again, and the town would fill again with its seasonal commerce and complication. Sarah had been in Caldwell for 8 months. She had her room at Clara's and her position at Denton's, and a raise that Amos had delivered in March with the air of a man who had considered the alternative and found it untenable. She had friends, Clara, irreplaceable, Mrs. Adeline Porter, the schoolteacher, who had identified Sarah as intellectually compatible and had proceeded accordingly, 2 or 3 women from the church whose steady company she had come to value. She had a life that was her own, constructed by her own choices, dependent on her own continued competence and care. She also had Emmett Covington. They had been courting through the winter and early spring with the particular attentiveness of 2 people who both understood the stakes of getting this right. He walked with her on Sunday afternoons. He brought books, and they discussed them. He took her to the small traveling lecture that came through Caldwell in February, a naturalist from the University of Kansas talking about the prairie ecosystem, which had been fascinating to both of them in the specific way of people who like to understand the world they're actually standing in. He was a man who showed his feelings through action rather than declaration, which meant that, when he did speak directly about what he felt, the words had a weight that no amount of rhetoric could approximate. He told her he loved her on a May evening, standing on Clara's front porch while the last light went gold over the prairie, in words that were simple and direct and contained no performance whatsoever. "I love you," he said. "I don't say it as a pressure or an expectation of anything particular in return. I say it because it's true and because you deserve to know it." She was quiet for one moment, not hesitating, but inhabiting the moment fully, the way you inhabit a thing when you want to be completely present in it. "I love you," she said. "I have for some time. I wanted to be sure of it before I said it." "Are you sure?" he asked. "Completely," she said. He reached up and touched her face with both hands gently, carefully, as though she were something of great value, and he kissed her for the first time, and it was everything she had been too sensible to allow herself to imagine, and she kissed him back with the full, unhesitating conviction of a woman who has finally found something true enough to move toward without reservation. Clara Whitfield was visible through the front window, apparently very busy with something at the bookshelf, and she happened to be facing entirely the wrong direction to notice anything that was occurring on the porch. The proposal came in June. It was not produced from a theatrical knee. Emmett was not theatrical. It came in the middle of a conversation, on a Sunday afternoon on the east bank of the Chicaskia River, where they had ridden out for the afternoon, and it arrived in the way that all genuine things arrived from him, as a natural extension of what was already true rather than an intervention in it. They were talking about the future, her future, his future, the way they'd both been moving through their individual situations as though aware those situations were going to eventually require some kind of deliberate structural arrangement. And he said, "I've been thinking about land." "Land," she said. "There's a quarter section available 3 miles east of town. Good grass, access to water. I've been saving for 2 years." He looked at the river. "It's enough to start with." She looked at him. He looked back, and in his October Creek eyes there was everything she had ever wanted in a man and had spent years being told she was asking for too much by wanting. "I'm asking you," he said, "if you want to build something on it with me, as my wife, if that's something you want." She said, "Is that a question or a statement?" He smiled. "It's a question." "Then yes," she said, "it's something I want." He took her hand, and they sat by the river in the June afternoon, and they talked about the quarter section and what could be built on it, and what a life out there could look like. And it was the most practical and most romantic conversation she had ever participated in. And she thought about her father's ledger column philosophy of women's worth, and felt something that had lived in her chest for 26 years finally and completely release. They were married in the Caldwell Methodist Church in August of 1884, exactly 1 year after Sarah had stepped off the stage into the heat and noise of a cattle town that had tried, in its first hour, to make her feel like nothing. Clara Whitfield stood up with Sarah. A man named George Ashby, who worked with Emmett at Garfield Moss's operation and had become his closest friend in Caldwell, stood up with Emmett. The church was full. Caldwell's permanent community had taken a proprietary interest in the union, as small communities do in things they approve of, and there was a quality of satisfaction in the room that day that felt like the town voting for a version of itself it preferred. The vows were traditional. It was 1884, and they were both people who respected the weight of words, which meant they understood why certain words had been chosen over time. But Emmett added something at the end that was not in the traditional form. He said quietly in front of everyone and therefore entirely for her, "I promise to see you clearly every day and to make sure you know what I see." Sarah said, "I promise the same." Clara cried, which she denied afterward with great firmness. The quarter section east of town had a small house on it that had been started by a previous settler who'd gone back east before he finished it, and Emmett spent the summer completing it with help from George Ashby and 2 of his other friends, and a focused, systematic attention to the work that produced, by the time they moved in, a house that was small but sound and well-made, and full of the particular dignity of things done right. Sarah continued her work at Denton's through the summer, riding in 3 days a week, which Amos Denton accommodated with considerable flexibility, because he had by now fully accepted that the loss of Sarah Thatcher would represent an accounting catastrophe. She also began keeping the books for 2 other Caldwell merchants who had heard about her competence through the community's reliable telegraph of reputation, and the income from this work was her own, which she kept in a separate account at the town's small bank, which Emmett encouraged with a simple logic. Everything you earn is yours. What we choose to do together with our resources is a joint conversation, but your money is not mine by default. She had stared at him when he said this. That, she had said, is genuinely radical. It's reasonable, he said. The law may not see it that way, we do. They made their own law on the quarter section east of Caldwell, in the small, complete world of what they were building together. The first winter in their own home was the winter that Sarah understood in all its dimensions, what it meant to be known. Emmett was not perfect. He was a man of real, specific qualities and real, specific limitations. He was sometimes too quiet when she needed words from him. He could disappear into a problem, a horse that needed particular work, a mechanical issue with the property, with such total absorption that the rest of the world temporarily ceased to exist for him, which required occasional and direct renegotiation. He had a stubbornness that expressed itself as extreme patience with everything except his own convictions, which he held without much flexibility, and learning where those convictions lived and how to approach them when they needed to be discussed was a project of ongoing and interesting complexity. She was not perfect either. She had a sharpness that could cut when she was frightened or overwhelmed, the specific defensive weapon of a woman who had spent too long with people who used vulnerability against her. She had anxieties about money and security that the past 2 years' self-sufficiency had not entirely resolved and probably wouldn't for some time yet. She had a pride that sometimes made her refuse help she actually needed, which Emmett had learned to approach with a sideways patience that communicated both respect for her pride and concern for the practical situation simultaneously. They learned each other. They were honest with each other in the specific, sometimes uncomfortable way that genuine intimacy requires. They fought occasionally real arguments, not the theatrical ones that were performances about power, but the actual kind that arise from 2 real people with real convictions trying to navigate shared life. And they resolved those arguments by coming back to the conversation after appropriate cooling, and engaging with what the disagreement was actually about rather than what it had presented itself as. It was, in short, a real marriage between two real people who genuinely loved and respected each other, which sounds like a small thing and is in fact the entire thing. In the spring of 1885, Sarah told Emmett she was expecting. He had been at the kitchen table with a piece of paper on which he was calculating some repair costs for the property, and he put the pencil down when she told him, and he looked at her with an expression that was so completely unguarded that she felt her eyes sting. "Is this?" he started. "Good," she said. "It's good. I'm glad. Are you?" He stood up and crossed the kitchen and held her face in his hands the way he always had, that specific gesture of his that communicated everything words sometimes couldn't keep up with. "I am so glad," he said. The son they named James Thomas Covington, James for Emmett's father. Thomas not for her former fiancé but for her grandfather, which had a longer and better history, and which she had decided to reclaim rather than abandon to association, arrived in December of 1885, healthy and vigorous, and equipped with what Clara Whitfield called his father's eyes and his mother's opinion of how things ought to go. He was delivered with considerable assistance from Clara and the town doctor, a capable man named Whitmore who had come to Caldwell from Philadelphia and had never entirely forgiven himself for it, but who had decided to make himself useful since he was here. Emmett was outside the bedroom door for 3 hours, which Clara told him firmly was entirely normal, and which he spent in the specific quality of silence that was not patience, but was what you did with fear when you were someone who understood that most things were not improved by making the fear loud. When Clara opened the door and said it was done and they were both fine, he put one hand against the door frame and closed his eyes for a moment, and Clara had the wisdom to simply go back inside and let him have that. James was the best thing that had happened to either of them, including, as Emmett said one evening while the baby was asleep in his cradle, and the winter was doing its work outside the windows, and the fire was the best sound in the world, each other, which was saying something. "He has your exactness," Emmett said. He meant the way the baby assessed the world with those steady gray-green eyes, taking everything in, filing it away, forming conclusions that wouldn't be spoken for years. "He's already figuring everything out. He has your quietness," Sarah said, "which in a baby is remarkably restful." Emmett smiled and pulled her closer in the lamplight, and she leaned into him with the specific ease of someone who has been exactly where they belong for long enough that belonging has become the baseline condition of life. Clara Whitfield came for Christmas that year and spent 3 days at the house on the quarter section east of Caldwell, and declared it the finest homestead she had seen in 2 years of paying attention to homesteads, which Emmett received with characteristic quiet satisfaction, and Sarah received with the complete vindication of someone who had chosen exactly right. The years settled into the particular richness that comes from building something real. Emmett's horsework became more than employment. By 1887, he had leased additional land adjacent to their quarter section and was running his own small horse breeding and training operation, with a reputation that pulled buyers from other parts of the territory. It was specialized, careful work that reflected everything that was true about who he was, and it supported a life that was, by the standards of the frontier and the standards of any place, genuinely good. Sarah's accounting practice grew with the town, which grew steadily through the mid-1880s as the cattle trade matured and more permanent settlement followed in its economic wake. She was not merely keeping books anymore. She was advising small businesses on their financial structures, which was a function that didn't have an established name in 1887 Kansas, but which she performed with considerable skill. She had built something of her own that was professional and substantial and respected, and the doing of it had resolved, in the most practical possible way, the last residue of her father's ledger column philosophy. She was worth exactly what she had demonstrated herself to be worth, and that turned out to be quite a lot, and she had demonstrated it herself, which was the part that mattered. In 1888, a daughter arrived, Elizabeth Grace Covington, Grace for the woman Emmett had once nearly married, and had remembered with enough honesty and generosity to want to honor, which was one of the things about Emmett Covington that Sarah loved with the specific intensity of someone who recognizes genuine character. Elizabeth had her mother's coloring and her father's stillness, and a laugh that arrived from somewhere operatic and made every person in the room involuntarily smile. James, at nearly 3 years old, regarded his sister with the solemn assessment of a firstborn who was conducting an extended feasibility study on the new arrangement, and then decided she was acceptable, which turned out to be the beginning of a sibling affection that would carry both of them through everything that came after. Clara visited and held Elizabeth and said, "She's going to be formidable," in a tone that suggested she found this extremely satisfying. "She comes from formidable stock," Emmett said, and looked at Sarah in that way that still, 5 years into their marriage, made her feel like the most completely visible person in the room. There was a day in the spring of 1889 when Sarah was at her desk. She had a proper office now, converted from a spare room in the house, with a good desk from a furniture maker in Wichita and adequate shelving, and a window that faced east so the morning light came in cleanly, and she could work before the children were fully awake. And she was going over the accounts for 3 Caldwell merchants simultaneously, and she stopped in the middle of a column of figures and simply sat. She sat with the window light on her face, and the sound of Emmett somewhere outside working with the horses, and the distant sound of James, saying something to Elizabeth in the particular carrying voice of a 3-year-old engaged in important communication. And she thought about the woman who had stepped off a stage in August of 1883 with $32 and a forged letter, and a chest full of damage that other people had put there. She thought about how that woman had walked into a saloon and felt the room try to compress her into something small, and had stood straight because her mother had taught her to stand straight, and had held on to herself with both hands because she had learned that no one else was going to do it for her. And then she thought about a door opening quietly, and a man who did not perform, who held out a bag strap instead of an opinion, and who said that she seemed like she might qualify for the category of people who made a town better. She thought about all the cowboys before him, the ones who had talked past her and over her and through her and at her, who had assessed her and categorized her and found her wanting or found her serviceable or found her ornamental, and had never once found her simply real. She thought about every room that had tried to make her smaller and every man who had been the instrument of that compression, starting with her father and proceeding through Thomas Greer, and every variation of Beau Harlan she had encountered along the way. And she thought about what it had done to her, all of that not destroyed her, because she was too stubborn for that and probably too lucky in some fundamental way, but marked her, left her defended in ways that had cost her energy every single day, left her armored against the exact kind of love she had most needed. And she thought about how one quiet man, with no performance and no agenda and no particular interest in anything except what was actually true, had made all of that not disappear, because things like that don't disappear. They only stop being the loudest voice but manageable, contextualizable, part of her history rather than the governing force of her present. She owed that to her own work. She was honest enough to give herself credit for the work she had done on herself, the choices she had made, the courage that had moved her out of Abilene and through Wichita and into Caldwell with $32, and a determination to become her own guarantee. But she also owed it to a door that opened quietly and the man who had walked through it. She went outside. Emmett was in the paddock with a young mare he'd been working with for 2 weeks, a bay horse that had come to him skittish and unhappy, as they sometimes did, and was coming along in the patient way that things came along when they were given the right conditions. He was not doing anything dramatic. He was standing near the horse, not touching it, just being present in its vicinity with the complete stillness that was his particular gift, letting the animal understand that proximity was not threat. He heard her at the fence and turned, and his face did the thing it always did when he looked at her, that specific opening, that genuine and uncalculated pleasure that she had never found the words for except this. She mattered to him. In the fullest, most complete sense, not as a category or a function or an investment, as herself. "You stopped in the middle of something," he said. He always knew. "I was thinking about how I got here," she said. "The whole sequence of it." He came to the fence. "And," he said, "and I'm glad," she said, "for all of it, even the parts that were terrible, because the sequence brought me here." He looked at her steadily. "I think about that too," he said. "The particular series of choices and chances that put two people in the same place at the same time and let everything else follow. Do you ever worry," she said, "that we might have missed each other, that if any one thing had been different?" "Sometimes," he said. "And then I think that that particular anxiety is about the past, which can't be changed, and that what I actually want to do with my time is pay attention to the present, which is here and real." He reached over the fence rail and took her hand. "And the present is very good." She held his hand. The mare in the paddock took 3 steps toward Emmett and stopped and breathed. "She's coming along," Sarah said. "She is," he said. "She had perfectly good reasons to be frightened. She just needed time and patience and the knowledge that she was safe." He looked at his wife when he said it. Sarah looked back at him and felt 12 feet tall. The life they had built by 1890 was something that her 22-year-old self, sitting at a dinner party in Dodge City, being called tiresome by Thomas Greer in front of 6 attentive couples, could not have imagined possible. Not because it was opulent, it wasn't, and neither of them wanted it to be, but because it was complete. It was full of the kind of richness that nobody could put in a ledger column, because it wasn't that kind of wealth. It was the wealth of days that added up to something. Work that was honest and valued, children who were loved and knew it. A man and a woman who had chosen each other with clear eyes, and kept choosing daily, with the specific and renewable intention of people who understood what they had. James was 4 years old and interested in horses with an intensity that Emmett found deeply satisfying and Sarah found mildly alarming. And Elizabeth was 2, and already constructing sophisticated arguments for why bedtime was a concept worth challenging. And Clara Whitfield was still running her boarding house on 2nd Street with undiminished authority, and visiting the Covington Quarter section every Sunday for dinner, which had become a standing arrangement that no one had explicitly established, but everyone, including Clara, observed as binding. In September of 1890, they sat on the porch of the house east of Caldwell on a Sunday evening while the late summer light did its long, beautiful work across the Kansas plain, and the children were inside with Clara, who was reading to James with her customary dramatic investment in the material. The horses moved in the paddock. The whole ranch, which is what it was now properly, though small, lay quiet in the golden hour. "Are you happy?" Emmett asked. It was not a question he asked often. He was more likely to express and demonstrate than to inquire, which meant that when he did ask, it was because he genuinely wanted to know. Sarah thought about it with the full consideration it deserved. "Yes," she said, "completely." "Good," he said. The word carried everything it always carried when he said it, that whole, unqualified satisfaction on behalf of a correct and proper outcome. She leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her and they watched the prairie do what the prairie did in that specific hour, which was everything, just quietly. "I want another," she said. He turned to look at her. "Child," she clarified. "I know what you meant," he said, and there was the smile, full, unguarded, the room-inside-a-room smile she had been the recipient of for 6 years now, and which still managed to recalibrate her internal weather every single time. "So do I." The third child, a boy they named Robert, not for her father as a vindication or a revisionism, but because she had decided that the name itself was neutral, and that she was finished allowing bad associations to exile perfectly good words, arrived in the spring of 1891. On a morning when the prairie was just beginning to green, and the horses were restless with the season, and Clara Whitfield arrived at the house before anyone called her because she said, a feeling. And her feelings about these things were reliably accurate. Robert was healthy and loud, and had a head of dark hair that would eventually go the same October Creek color as his father's eyes, and he regarded the world from his first moments, with an expression that Sarah called interested and Emmett called deliberate and Clara called exactly like his grandfather sounds in that letter you read me last Tuesday, which was directed at Sarah and was accurate. James took one look at his new brother and said, with the gravity of a 4-year-old who has been doing careful calculations, "Good, we needed another one." Elizabeth said, "He's small." She was not wrong and she was not being unkind. She was being precise. Sarah kissed her daughter's forehead and said, "He'll grow," and thought about all the ways that things that start small can become large when given the right conditions. By the winter of 1891, the Covington family on the quarter section east of Caldwell, Kansas, were 3 children and 2 people deep in a life that was sturdy and warm and full of the kind of ordinary daily richness that is the whole point of everything. The horse operation was doing well enough that Emmett had taken on a hand, a young man named Presley, who was 18 years old and serious about horses in the way that suggested a real future in it, and whom Emmett trained with the same patience and care he brought to everything. Sarah's accounting practice had grown to the point where she was maintaining books for 7 Caldwell businesses and consulting with 2 others, and she had begun to correspond with a woman in Wichita who was attempting to establish a formal bookkeeping and accounting firm specifically for women-owned businesses, which was an enterprise Sarah found enormously interesting and which she contributed to through letters, and when possible, through direct introduction of relevant clients. There was, in this period, a letter from her mother. Ellen Thatcher had found Sarah's address through a laborious series of intermediaries. She had not been given it directly, because Robert Thatcher had made it very clear that a daughter who disgraced the family by breaking an engagement and disappearing to the frontier was not a daughter who warranted correspondence. Ellen had worked around this with a persistence that suggested her years of apparent passivity had coexisted with resources of stubbornness that her husband had systematically underestimated. The letter was short and careful, written by a woman who was not yet entirely certain of her safety in saying what she wanted to say. It said that she was well. It said that Robert Thatcher had passed away in November of 1889 from a cardiac event, which Sarah received without drama and with a complex mixture of grief for the father who had never been quite the father she'd needed and relief for the woman now freed from the particular management of him. It said that Ellen was living with Sarah's older sister in Abilene and was carefully, she used the word carefully, finding the arrangement more agreeable than previous arrangements had been. It said that she had heard, through channels she did not specify, that Sarah was married and had children, and that she would very much like to hear about them if Sarah was willing. Sarah read the letter twice at her desk in the east-facing office, with the morning light coming through the window, and then she took it to Emmett, who read it without comment and handed it back to her and waited. "I'm going to write back," she said. "Good," he said. "She's my mother," Sarah said. "Whatever else is complicated, she's my mother and she's been through things I understand better now than I did when I left." "Good," he said again, and he meant it without reservation, and she loved him for the completeness of it. She wrote to Ellen Thatcher that same evening, at the kitchen table with the children asleep and Emmett reading by the fire, and the letter she wrote was 4 pages long and contained a full account of James and Elizabeth and new Robert and the house east of Caldwell, and the horses and Clara Whitfield, and the accounting practice and Emmett, particularly Emmett. Described with the kind of detail that a woman deploys when she wants to convey to her mother that she has found something that she herself needed her mother to find and never quite did. Ellen wrote back within the month. The letter was longer than the first and less careful, more like a woman practicing the use of a voice that had been kept quiet for a very long time. It was the beginning of a correspondence that would become, over the following years, one of the genuine and unexpected gifts of Sarah's adult life. In the summer of 1892, Ellen Thatcher came to visit. She arrived on the afternoon stage from Wichita, the same stage, the same direction in the same summer heat that Sarah had arrived on nearly 9 years earlier, and she was a woman in her late 50s who looked smaller than Sarah remembered and also subtly freer, the way people look when a long pressure has been removed and the shape they were always going to be is finally coming back. Sarah met her at the stage. They stood on the street in Caldwell and looked at each other for a moment that contained everything. And then Ellen opened her arms and Sarah went into them without the armor she would have needed before Emmett taught her, by example and by love, that not everything required protection. Ellen met Emmett at the house that afternoon. She had heard 4 pages of description across 18 months of letters, and she looked at him with the specific assessment of a mother who has learned the hard way that her judgment had not always been reliable and is therefore being careful. He shook her hand and said it was good to have her there, and then James came barreling through the kitchen in his 6-year-old way, and Emmett caught him with one arm and said, "James, this is your grandmother." And James looked at Ellen Thatcher with his father's steady, assessing eyes and said, "Are you staying?" Ellen said, "For 2 weeks if that's all right." James considered this and said, "Good," in a tone that was so completely his father's that Sarah had to look at the window. Ellen stayed for 3 weeks. She helped with the children and she sat in Sarah's office and watched Sarah work and said, one afternoon when the children were napping and Emmett was out with the horses, "I owe you an apology." Sarah said, "For what specifically?" "For not showing you," Ellen said, "that there was any other way to be. For letting you believe by example that what you saw between me and your father was what marriage was supposed to be." "You didn't know," Sarah said carefully. "I suspected," Ellen said. "But I didn't have the courage for the alternative." She looked at her hands. "You had the courage. You were always going to have it. I think you were born knowing something I didn't learn until I was too old to use it the way I might have." "You're using it now," Sarah said. "I am," Ellen said. "Better late." Sarah reached across the kitchen table and took her mother's hand, and Ellen Thatcher's eyes filled and she blinked carefully and straightened the way she'd always straightened. But this time the straightening did not look like bracing against impact. It looked like standing on her own 2 feet, which was different. Emmett came in from outside, read the room in 1 complete second, poured 3 cups of coffee without being asked, and sat down and talked to Ellen about James's interest in horses in a way that gave both women the moment they needed to collect themselves, which was precisely and exactly the right thing to do. Later that night, when the house was quiet and the children were asleep and Ellen was in the guest room that had been Sarah's old office before she'd converted the new one, Sarah lay in the dark and said to Emmett, "You're a good man." "I'm a regular man," he said. "No," she said. "You're not." She was quiet for a moment. "Regular men made me feel small in enough different ways and for long enough that I had started to believe it was just the nature of the transaction, what women were supposed to accept in exchange for the security of being attached to a man. You made me feel worth considerable notice. That's not regular." He was quiet beside her. "I notice you," he said, "because you're worth noticing. I can't take credit for that." "You can take credit," she said, "for deciding to say so. And for saying it without agenda, and for the 11,000 subsequent instances of the same basic approach." He laughed, low and quiet in the dark. 12, he said. "What?" 12,000, he said. "Clara rounds down." She laughed and pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the chest that had braced against impact for so many years expand, fully and without reservation, with the breath of a woman who had found her way to exactly where she was supposed to be. The years that followed were full ones. Robert learned to walk and then to run, and then to climb things he was specifically prohibited from climbing, which occupied considerable attention. Elizabeth learned to read at 4 and was subsequently unstoppable, which delighted Sarah and Emmett equally. James learned horses from his father with a dedication that was clear by age 7 and unambiguous by 10, and Emmett taught him with the same patient, honest methodology he brought to everything, which meant James learned not only the technical skill but the underlying philosophy, that a creature's history shapes its behavior, that fear is not defiance, that patience and consistency build trust in ways that force cannot. Clara Whitfield's health began to slow her in 1894, and Sarah noticed it and did something about it. She increased her Sunday visits. She arranged for one of Clara's newer boarders to assist with the heavier household tasks, and she brought the children with her regularly, because Clara's relationship with James and Elizabeth and Robert was one of the most mutually sustaining things in all their lives, and Sarah was not going to let inconvenience erode it. Clara said, one Sunday in the fall of 1894, sitting in her own parlor with Robert on her knee and Elizabeth doing something editorial to Clara's bookshelf and James engaged in a lengthy silent conversation with Clara's aged and philosophical cat. "You know, when you walked into my boarding house in August of 1883, I thought, here is a woman who has been compressed into a smaller shape than her actual dimensions. And I thought, this town is going to try to do more of the same. And I was right about that part." "You were," Sarah said. "What I didn't know," Clara said, "was that you'd uncurl. Some women don't. The compression gets structural." She looked at Sarah over Robert's head. "You uncurled completely. It's very satisfying to witness." "I had help," Sarah said. "You had yourself," Clara said firmly, "which you'd had all along, and then you had Emmett, which was a fine addition." She adjusted her hold on Robert, who was making a determined effort to reach the cat. "But the self came first. That's the part women need to know." "Yes," Sarah said. "Put it somewhere useful," Clara said. Sarah thought about that for a long time. She thought about the women she corresponded with in Wichita. She thought about the wives of the businessmen whose books she kept, some of whom had come to her not just for accounting but for conversation, for the specific resource of a woman who had built something on her own and was willing to talk about how. She thought about what it would mean to be more deliberate about that, to make it less incidental. She mentioned this to Emmett. He said, "What would it look like?" She described it, something between a lending library of practical knowledge and a regular gathering, something that gave women in Caldwell access to information and conversation that the formal structures of the town did not reliably provide. "Clara's parlor," he said immediately. "She'd love it, and it would give her something to organize." He was completely right on both counts. The women's practical meeting. It never had a formal name, which Clara said was a feature, not a bug, because formal names attracted formal opposition, met twice a month in Clara's parlor from the spring of 1895. And it became one of the genuinely useful things in Caldwell, a place where women could learn about accounts and contracts and their legal rights as they existed under Kansas law, and what to do when those rights were insufficient, which was often. Sarah ran it with the methodical care she brought to everything, and it grew, and it mattered, and she was proud of it in the specific way you are proud of things you built from an honest recognition of what was needed. In 1896, Clara Whitfield died on a Tuesday morning in March, quietly in her own room in her own boarding house, which is how she would have arranged it if she'd had any choice in the matter, and possibly she had. She was 75 years old and had outlasted every specific thing she decided to outlast, and had left the world, in Sarah's view, measurably better than she'd found it. The loss was profound. Sarah had loved Clara with the specific, irreplaceable love of a woman who recognizes, in another woman, the particular combination of strength and generosity and honesty that she has been learning to cultivate in herself. She grieved genuinely and fully, which Emmett understood and gave her space to do, and she spoke at the service about what Clara had meant to her in terms that were accurate and honest and made most of the room cry, including, twice, herself. Clara left her boarding house to a niece from Missouri, and she left Sarah a small sum of money and a letter that Sarah kept in her desk drawer for the rest of her life. The letter said, "You came here already whole, even if you didn't know it. The trick of this life is learning to believe what's actually true about you and letting in the people who see it clearly. You did both. That's the whole instruction manual. Give my love to Emmett and those children and keep uncurling. James was 11 years old when Clara died, and he understood loss in the serious, thorough way of his nature, and he came to Sarah afterward and sat with her without saying much because he knew, already, that presence was sometimes the whole answer. He was his father's son. Elizabeth organized a collection of wildflowers for Clara's grave that was so architecturally ambitious it required 3 of Clara's boarders to help carry it, which Clara would have found exactly appropriate. Robert, who was 5 and not yet in possession of all the philosophical equipment for grief, drew a picture of Clara's cat and gave it to the niece from Missouri, which the niece found so unexpectedly touching that she cried into her handkerchief for 10 minutes, and then asked Robert if he'd like a piece of pie, which he accepted with the philosophical pragmatism of a 5-year-old. Life continued as life does, now weighted with Clara's absence and enriched by what she had left behind. The children grew in their individual, surprising ways, James toward horses and then, surprisingly, toward the law, having decided in his early teens that the rules that governed people's lives were as important as the rules that governed their land, and eventually, in his 20s, reading law with a firm in Wichita. Elizabeth toward books and eventually toward teaching, which was the profession she had been pointed toward since the moment she reorganized Clara's bookshelf at age 5. Robert toward horses like his father, toward the land like his father, toward the quiet strength of a man who did things properly because properly was the only way worth doing them. Emmett's horse operation grew through the 1890s into something that other men in the territory recognized and respected, and the reputation was entirely built on the quality of the work rather than any strategy of self-promotion, which meant it was the durable kind. He was 43 years old in 1896, and there was gray at his temples and in the line of his jaw, and it suited him with the specific rightness of things that have earned their age. Sarah was 39, and she wore her years with the same quality, not despite what they contained, but because of it. She had the face of a woman who had been through real things, and had come out the other side with her sense of humor intact and her spine straight and her eyes clear, and this was its own kind of beauty, different from the kind that youth provides by default and more interesting. They were sitting on the porch one evening in October of 1896, October again, the month whose color lived in Emmett's eyes, the prairie gone to amber and gold in the long slant of afternoon, and Robert was inside doing something domestic with impressive noise, and the older two were in their own lives, James in Wichita and Elizabeth teaching the 3 grades of Caldwell's elementary school with a dedication that was making the school board quietly nervous about what they'd unleashed. And Emmett said, "Tell me something true." It was a game they had developed over many years, when the comfortable silence of the evening wanted the ballast of honesty. You said something true that you hadn't said yet, something real about that day or that week or that current state of your interior life. Sarah thought. "I was thinking today about the year I arrived here," she said. "About everything I was carrying that I thought was just who I was. All the ways I'd been told I was too much and also not enough simultaneously." She looked at the amber prairie. "And I was thinking that I wouldn't change any of it because the whole sequence of it brought me here. But I was also thinking how much easier it would have been to be believed from the beginning, to have been seen clearly from the first, rather than having to spend so many years earning back a sense of my own worth that should never have been taken in the first place." He listened to all of this. "You deserved that from the beginning," he said, "the seeing clearly." "I know," she said. "Now, what you did," he said, "with what you had, that matters, but you're right that it shouldn't have cost that much to begin with." She looked at him. "Tell me something true," she said. He was quiet for a long October moment. "I think about the morning I walked into that saloon," he said. "I've thought about it more times than I can count. How close it was another morning, another errand first, a different route across town, and I'd have walked by. And you'd have handled it yourself because you would have, but I wouldn't have known about you, and everything that followed wouldn't have followed." He paused. I think about how thin the margin is between the life you get and the life you barely miss. And she said, "And I am," he said simply and entirely, "the most grateful man in Kansas." She took his hand. The prairie held them in its October light, on the porch of the house they had built, on the land they had chosen, in the life they had made from the improbable, unlikely, necessary collision of a quiet man and a woman who had been made small by enough people that she had forgotten briefly how large she actually was. They remembered together. That was the whole of it, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything. Robert came out of the house holding a plate of something he had apparently constructed in the kitchen with more ambition than skill, and he stood in the doorway with it and said, "I made biscuits." Emmett turned from the Prairie View to look at his youngest son. "How did they turn out?" he said. Robert considered the plate with the deliberate honesty of a child who has not yet learned to manage expectations. "Some of them," he said, "are better than others." Sarah laughed genuinely, fully, from the place in her chest that had been compressed for so many years and had now been open for long enough that it was the baseline condition of her life. She laughed and held out her hand for a biscuit, and Emmett took one too, and Robert sat down on the porch step between them with the plate, and the three of them ate biscuits of variable quality in the October light, while the horses moved in the paddock and the Kansas prairie held them all in its enormous, indifferent, somehow deeply personal embrace. And Sarah Thatcher Covington, who had arrived in this town with $32 and a forged letter, and a chest full of other people's opinions about how much space she was permitted to occupy, who had stood straight in a saloon full of laughter, and held on to herself with both hands because no one else was going to do it for her, who had found and been found by a quiet man who looked at her and saw something worth considerable notice, and had the specific integrity to say so without agenda or performance or any hidden motive whatsoever. This woman sat on her porch in the October light and was, completely and without remainder, exactly herself. Which was, as it turned out, quite a lot, more than enough. The right amount exactly.